All right, everybody, welcome back to session 3, the third session on day 2 of the Art of the Sword conference, the fundraising conference for History Live Northeast. Yet again, I'm Matt Blazik, Executive Director. Thank you all for being here. Our next session is with Andrew Frasier, another friend of mine. He comes to us from New Zealand. He runs the YouTube channel Popula Urbanum, and he is also known online as the Modern Medieval Man. So I love watching, following him on Facebook and on Instagram, and watching his YouTube channel. I always learn something from him whenever he puts something up. So he's going to be giving a talk today called "The Good Guy with the Sword," talking about violence in the medieval cities. So I'm going to bring him up and he'll introduce himself a little bit. And here we go. Good. I don't even, is it like 2 o'clock in the morning for you, Andrew?
No, not anymore. It's 7 a.m. It's a reasonable hour now.
Reasonable. Well, thank you.
From New Zealand talking.
It is New Zealand. It is New Zealand talking.
7 a.m. tomorrow morning.
So thank you. Thank you for, how's the future? Is it?
Oh, it's bright.
Okay. Well, thank you again so much for joining us. We're looking forward to hearing your talk. So tell us a little bit about yourself first and then get right into it.
Well, first I'd like to say kia ora, morena, good morning, everyone. It's been up since 3:30 this morning to join everyone. So it's been something. A little bit tired, so excuse me if I kind of zone out. I've had lots of coffee though, which is a blessing. I'm Andrew Fraiser. I'm from Popula Urbanum and Modern Medieval Man. I'm a reenactor, researcher, HEMA practitioner, and an adult educator. I've been practicing HEMA and reenacting for about 20 years, so that probably should give you a fair idea of my age, but I won't age myself too much in that. What I normally do is talk about the urban middle class and the rise of the middle class in the medieval period. And one of my big interests is the middle class and their obsession with violence and policing violence. So and the guilds. So if you know anything about my channel and what we do, we talk about the guilds and how they're tied into the rise of the modern state. And what that also entails is the how they police violence. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I know this is about swords, so I'll focus primarily on swords, but you can't really talk about violence if you're not talking about other types of weapons, which is awesome, following up James, because James actually talked about some things that kind of leads into how the urban environment dealt with violence, and all the really interesting things that they used instead of swords, like knives and long knives and sword-like weapons and sword-like knives. So that's kind of cool. That's kind of a obsession of mine, and I'm trying to find someone that's going to make me one of those really interesting long knives that you see in the just laying around. So anyway, that's a topic for another time.
Okay, I'm sure there's somebody here that would love to do that for you.
Yeah, I'm sure. So yeah, that's my latest obsession, is just one of those sort of really long knife, knife sword things. Anyway, so talking about urban violence and how they policed it, but also how urban violence existed. We have a bit of a, I guess, conception of the medieval period being particularly violent. And then as the modern period came along, it got less violent, which is not necessarily true. We kind of look at the medieval period as being violent because it was tumultuous. The 14th century in itself was facing a crisis. It was a crisis not only of wars, you've got the 100 Years' War, but you've also got a period of riots, and you've got a period of rebellions, and that leading into the modern period, that huge change post Black Death as well, kind of skews things. But the medieval cities themselves were obsessed with peace, and the way that they policed that was really important to them. So while there was violence, I'm not going to deny that, it's really interesting to think about how they tried to police that, and what they did to engage in intrapersonal violence. So I think the first thing that we need to do is think about who was conducting violence. So we've got a kind of a system in the medieval cities of, while they're nominally free, so you've got your free cities, they've kind of got a hierarchy as well. You've got people who are your laborers. You've got your journeymen, the members of the guilds. You've got your burghers, your burgher elites, and the patrician elites, and they're kind of creating a hierarchy within themselves. And within those cities, they are self-governing, and that self-governing elite essentially is made up of sometimes the patrician elites, and they have the ruling councils, and they pass laws to look after the town, essentially, and they may also have a council that passes judgment, and that might be separate to the nobles, a noble court, and those two courts might pass laws or judgments separately. And this is going to be important to later, so I'm just kind of setting this all up. So you've got two separate courts sometimes. So you've got the mercantile courts or the town council's courts, and then you might have, say for example, the nobles' courts or the king's court, and they all pass judgments on crimes. But when we're talking about violent crimes, we need to understand what a violent crime is. So how medieval people perceive violence is completely different to how we perceive violence today. So medieval people entered into disputes quite often. How they interacted with violence and those disputes was quite frequent. So for a medieval person, their honor was paramount. So if I was to offend you or insult you, I would be besmirching your honor, and it would be expected that I would apologize. If I didn't apologize or I didn't make amends, that would result in fines. But at the same time, if say for example, I called somebody a name or swore, that's verbal abuse, it's verbal assault, and that could result in an altercation, and often would result in what they call pulling of knives, because everyone carried a knife. Everyone was expected to be armed, and the pulling of knives would happen. And when that pulling of knives would happen, often people would die, and that disagreement in that death would be punishable in different ways. So the way they viewed that death as well was different. So if there was an argument and somebody died, how that was perceived as an argument, that was an accidental death. That was the least worst death that you could have. If, say for example, two people had a fight, and so I was walking along the street and somebody ambushed me and I killed that person, that would be in self-defense. That was justifiable. that was okay for me to do because I'd been assaulted. That was perfectly fine. That was a justifiable death because I was protecting myself against an aggressor. Maybe they were trying to rob me. They were a baddie. It's okay. But again, there was another form of death or crime where I could be arrested or whatever else for, and that would be manslaughter. So that's different to an accidental death, where perhaps I'd intentionally killed the victim. So I went over to someone's house because, hey, look, we'd had a disagreement the day before. I'd killed them. I had a beef, but I hadn't gone out to kill them, but I'd definitely gone out to beat them up. I'd gone out with my friends. I'd had a sword. I maybe had a stick or, a club or a staff or whatever, and I beat them up. And they died as a result of this. That was manslaughter. It was kind of like, but the worst the worst type of crime that I could commit would definitely be murder. And for medieval people, that was the most shocking type of death, most shocking type of crime. And that comes from the word mortha. It's a sort of Germanic root word meaning hidden death, where I killed somebody and I hid it. And that's really tied up to the idea that killing wasn't bad, particularly in early medieval cultures. So killing someone wasn't bad. People kill people for all the time. It was more based on honor. So if I killed somebody and put the body out in, say, for a really public place, as far as early medieval people were concerned, they probably deserved it. It was an honor killing. There was probably a feud, and that was part of the ritual behavior of death. And then there would be some form of ritual payment, like what people would call a weregild, and that would be paid off between the families, and that would hopefully settle that feud. But the hidden death was the bad thing. So if I killed somebody and then hid that crime, and I tried to flee from the murder or the killing, or I hid the body and then I didn't admit to it, that was the worst crime that you could commit when it comes to a slaying. And that idea carried on to the late medieval periods as well, that killing someone and then hiding it was the worst crime that you commit when it came to killing people, that you couldn't kill somebody and then hide or flee. You had to make compensation. You had to face the crime, because what the death did was disrupt the community, and it disrupted people's lives, and you couldn't actually face punishment, whether that be physical punishment, spiritual punishment, or make compensation and reduce the feuds within the community. And we'll talk about that later. When we're talking about pulling of knives wasn't, even though everyone did it, it wasn't acceptable. If you should pull knives, you would face a fine. We didn't want people disturbing the peace, because maintaining the peace in the cities was paramount. We really want people within medieval cities, because they're very chaotic places. But more importantly, they're places of business, and the cities existed for the conduct of business, and anything that destroyed commerce or the good name of commerce or the good name of the city was bad. So for the cities to maintain good reputation, they had to maintain the peace. So drawing of knives, pulling of knives, and having quarrels was seen as one of the more troublesome things. But it happened all the time, and the way it was punished, as is most most crimes within the medieval cities, at least minor crimes, but we'll talk about that later, was with a fine. So moving on, because I could just talk about that thing all the time, and we're running out of time, is what type of deaths and how was death perceived within the medieval cities, and actually how deadly were the
This is a concept of network security.
Sorry about that. Gotcha. Got it for you.
That's all good. It's all good. So what type of deaths were we seeing within medieval cities? So violence within the urban cities weren't actually that violent. Well, they were, but my assertion is that they weren't as dangerous as we commonly perceive. So if we look at the coroner's rolls from 1300 to 1340 from London, there were only, so it's 40 years, only 140 homicides. And London was a fairly large urban center for Europe. It's not the largest urban center in Northern Europe, but it's fairly large. So many of the deaths were related to quarrels. So there weren't people like just busting out, having big brawls or whatever. That's prior to all the sort of troubles, in the later part of the century. And many of the deaths aren't people just being stabbed and dying instantly. So what I'll do, I'm just going to bring up a few bits of data. I've got the data here. So most of the deaths in those 140 homicides, 44 of those deaths happened on a Sunday, and that's quite common because Sundays were the busiest day. Most of the days of the week you were working, but Sunday was the day everyone hung around and did stuff together. And let's have a look here. There's another bit of interesting thing, bit of data. Of those 140-ish deaths, the most common weapon used was the long knife at 51 cases, followed closely by the short knife at 29. The third most common one was the staff, and then the sword at 17, and then hands, people just, beating on each other with hands. But, the sword, by far not the most common weapon used in fighting. It's the long knife. But talking about swords, because we're here to talk about swords, I'm just going to recount two cases from the coroner's rolls of some attacks. So one example is in 1316, the coroner and the sheriffs were informed that Harvey of Playford in Suffolk had been found dead at some person's house in the parish of St. Augustine in Farringdon. They duly made their way there and opened an inquest. The jury found that at twilight on the previous Friday of that day, while on his way to the house of his host, Harvey had reached the entrance to St. Augustine's Church, where Robert Davy of Sudbury had been lying in wait for him. Robert then crept up, drew his sword, and gave 2 fatal wounds, one of them 11 inches long and 7 inches deep. After which, Harvey staggered to his host's house and collapsed just inside the door. He survived until an hour before sunset on the following Monday, so that's quite a long time, where he died of his wounds. The jury found that Robert had run away immediately after committing the crime. They did not know where he went or who he might have been giving him shelter. As far as they could discover, he had no goods or chattels. So just to give that context, because he had fled, all his goods would be forfeit. They would take all of his possessions and give it to the victim's family as compensation. But because he had nothing. They couldn't do that. They couldn't find any way to compensate the victim's family for that crime. And moving on to another account, on Wednesday, the Feast of St. Thomas, on the 21st of December, 1321, Robert Dennis, a goldsmith, was found dead of an unnatural death. I quite like that term. In the house of Dionysius of Cambridge. That's a pretty good name as well. His father, in the All Hallows of Bread Street parish in Cordwainer Ward. The investigative jury said that on Saturday, 6th of December at dusk, Robert and a certain John of Paston had came to the corner of Mary LeBeau Church in the lane of Cordwainer Street. So this place seems to be a bit, Cordwainer Street seems to be a bit dicey. They quarreled. As they quarreled, John of Paston drew his sword and cut off Robert's left hand. Thus wounded, he went to his father's house, where he received his ecclesiastical rites and lingered until the 20th of December. So, he lasted a little while, where he died in the morning. So, that's 14 days that he lasted. Yeah. So those are some accounts of London where people had been attacked by swords, and they obviously passed away. Now, we don't have any coroner's accounts of people surviving attacks with swords or surviving attacks with weapons. These are only deaths, because the coroners only noted deaths. So obviously there's more violence occurring where people didn't die. And as you can see, both of these people passed away due to their wounds. I mean, obviously having your hand cut off is quite a serious wound. But, they weren't dying suddenly from these attacks. And that's something that I really like to point out about a lot of these wounds that we do see with medieval weapons, that they're not necessarily instantly fatal. Which we'll, if I don't blather on too much, we'll try to get to about how medieval people were quite skilled in the use of their weapons. But how did medieval people react to violence? So the first thing they had to do is, it was expected that anyone witnessing violence had to call up the hue and cry. So the hue and cry, or some variations of it, all through medieval Europe, was the obligation that should you witness a crime, you had to react. You had to call up the hue and cry, which is making everyone aware around you that a crime was being committed, and you had to intervene. And everyone would try to stop the crime and apprehend the person committing the crime. If they didn't, they would themselves be charged with the same crime. So that was not only in rural areas, but in the cities. That was an important part of the sort of legal codes of the time. The cities also had the militias. So if you were a citizen of the cities, you were a part of the militias. The guilds themselves also maintained their own militias, and it worked on a roster. So most people in the cities were somewhat or very well trained in martial skills. In the sort of late 14th to 15th centuries, during off seasons, because the guilds often had a peak season and an off-peak season for many trades. Many young people, to maintain a decent wage, would actually sell their services off as mercenaries, and that's where most mercenary soldiers actually came from was the urban militias, and also the urban centers developed very heavy martial cultures in the 14th and 15th centuries. Future Pope Pius II, but at the time he was Aeneas Silvio Piccolomini. So I'm sorry, my Italian is terrible. That's what my Italian teacher used to tell me when I was a kid. Commented on the military preparedness in Germany in 1444. He wrote, "Not only every noble, but every burgher in the guilds has an armory in their house, so as to appear equipped at every alarm, and skill of the citizens in the use of weapons is extraordinary." And he's commenting on the German cities at the time. So not only are the urban cities, urban elites, should I say, arming themselves, but we can also see in the late 13th and 14th century, for example, in London, had a boom in sword and buckler martial arts schools. So Smithfield was rife with sword and buckler martial arts schools. So bad was this boom in martial arts for Smithfield that it became known as Ruffian Hall, and rival schools and gangs of roaming sword and buckler thugs became so epidemic for the city that sword and bucklers were banned after curfew, after lights out, and the Crown banned it twice, and also banned the opening of schools, except for those of good repute. So we know that the urban classes were engaging in martial arts by just these accounts. So carrying of swords and weapons were common for medieval people. The guilds halls had statutes banning the carrying of swords and wearing of armor in both guild halls, and the cities had laws banning the drawing of swords and knives, which I've covered earlier as well. So while some cities did have the banning of swords and carrying them during non-warlike times, so Nuremberg was a rare example of this. Most of them didn't. They did ban outsiders bringing in swords. Most citizens were expected to wear swords or have some type of weapon at all times. So good guy with the sword. We're here. We're finally here. So the good guy of the sword is the idea that when there is some form of altercation, people are drawing knives. How did that stop? Well, that's for the local people to intervene. So while there are militias or guards or armies or whoever else, half the time they're not intervening. Their job is to nominally protect the gates. And there is kind of a bad relationship with the urban citizens and often the militias, whom are generally hired to act as guards. So how does that interaction interfere with with the locals who are drawing knives? It gets tricky, and essentially what's happening, so two people are starting to draw knives and locals are coming in, the hue and cries coming up, and people are drawing weapons as well. So everyone, so it's kind of like everyone's drawing weapons, and what you're seeing is this instance where people are demanding to keep the peace. So the more and more people coming into I guess a violent situation, these interactions are being kept calm by what's known as the peace of the feud. And what I like to do here is actually bring up an example of Romeo and Juliet. Okay, so if you understand the peace of the feud, you actually understand what Romeo and Juliet is actually about. So you've got the two warring houses, big noble houses, and because they have a feud that has been going on for far too long, they're finally at peace. But the feud is what actually keeps the peace, because if it escalates, there's going to be a big war, and it's a local war. And that's how most urban elites actually operated. They had, like a Cold War. Yeah, exactly. So large urban families, powerful urban families, or dynasties were often at odds with each other, and they would have large duels, and it happened all the time. And it wasn't just in the Renaissance; it was in the late medieval period as well. There was often large duels and vying for power. And how the duels were stopped was through intermarriages and alliances. So if someone should break the peace of the feud, they would be exiled from the city. And that's what we see with Romeo. He's returned from exile. And when he returns from exile, he's expected to maintain the peace of the feud. But does he? No. And he breaks the feud. He stabs a dude. He messes around with Juliet, and he starts the war anew. And that's the same thing with medieval urban violence. By telling people to keep the peace, and you see multiple accounts of this where people are drawing knives, other people who are, citizens of the town, who are merchants, who are craftsmen, are rushing to the violence. They are drawing swords, they're drawing long knives, they're coming in with clubs, they're coming with staves, they're coming in with work knives. They're drawing weapons as well. And what they're doing is telling people, keep a cool head, don't use violence. Because everyone knows if violence should happen, what's going to happen is going to be a big brawl. People are going to start hitting each other with knives, and someone's going to die. So for the medieval people, what they're actually saying is, don't have a fight. Because if you do, we're going to start stabbing you. And that actually cools the situation. People aren't necessarily wanting to have a fight, but for the medieval person, honor and their fama, or how they're perceived, how people see them and know of them, is the most important thing in their lives. So they can't back down if someone disparages them. They have to appear to stand up for themselves, because no one else will. So if someone insults them, they're going to argue, they're going to pull a knife, and then everyone else has to come in and cool that situation. And the explicit threat of violence is what's cooling the tensions. His mate's going to come in, and his mate's going to come in, and then his mate's going to, and they're all going to pull in their knives, and they're going to say, well, let's calm things down with the threat of violence. Now, we obviously don't want to do that now. We have modern policing. We want people to de-escalate. And they would de-escalate in a different way, because no one actually wanted a big brawl with people with lots of knives stabbing people and whatever else. They didn't want that at all. So there's a comment there. Skill at wrestling and disarming would be important in the cities. Absolutely. And aside, that's why when I'm teaching HEMA, I start normally with teaching wrestling and dagger fighting, and then I go into the other longsword and whatever else first, because that, I believe, is the foundations. But that's aside. But we're thinking about urban violence as two different types of violence. You've got intrapersonal violence, the violence of people feuding and engaging in the feud. It's the violence of the feud. And then you've got the violence of martial violence. So the medieval people and the medieval urban space definitely starts engaging in creating its own martial culture, and creating a space that starts to challenge the state and the knighthood and creating its own armies. But those are two different things. But obviously, as they start creating their own martial culture, they start, that starts feeding back into that intrapersonal violence. And they use that violence, obviously, as well to enforce their political and financial interests as well. So, sometimes I like to say that the guilds are part labor union, part mafia, part commerce, interest. We don't really have an analogy in the modern era because they're enforcing their personal interests as opposed to labor interests. They're blocking other people out from entering into the city, and they'll definitely use violence to do it. Like the mafia. Think of that what you will. But yeah, so that's in brief urban violence in the cities. I think we'll possibly jump to questions now.
Thank you, Andrew. That was really, really interesting. If anything, I think I'll always take away from this, whenever I teach anything about Romeo and Juliet again, it will always be he stabbed a dude and then messed around with Juliet. I think that's exactly how I will always do that.
Well, I always, once I learned more about the context of urban violence and the piece of the feud, which unfortunately I never get enough time when I talk about this type of thing about what it is that Romeo and Juliet, and Romeo is not the good guy. I don't believe that Shakespeare ever wrote Romeo and Juliet where Romeo is the good guy. He's the bad guy. He's come in and he's upset the balance of the peace of the city. And if anything, Paris is the good guy, and that's why he's killed. That's the tragedy. Because someone tell me if I'm wrong, probably going to be wrong here because it's been so long since I've done anything about with Romeo and Juliet since high school. But Paris was meant to marry Juliet. That was meant to be all said and done, and he's come in and he's ruined everything. He's come in and he's ruined everything. So he's not the good guy.
We'll see if we got any questions here.
Well, of course, I have a question.
Oh, go for it.
I'm reading right now a fairly old book about the golden age of Burgundy, and they talk about the four Valois dukes of Burgundy trying to turn it into its own nation and kingdom, basically during the 1300s, 1400s. And what happens is both the French royal family and the dukes keep fomenting anger and disruption and difficulties in various cities. They try to get the Parisian guilds to riot and are successful in getting people being dragged out of buildings and killed, and fires, and then the French do that to the Burgundian cities and Liège, and everybody. It looked like the urban centers were targets for political agitators. And how frequently did cities, I mean, it's all very dramatic, but how frequently did cities actually erupt into mass rioting and destruction and things like that? Do you have a number? Or
I mean, so from essentially the late 1300s, there was over 1,200 minor, including the minor rebellions and whatever else, and disputes, over 1,200 rebellions, feuds, rebellions, and whatever you want to call them. Yeah, 1,200 until the early modern period.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. That's one of my key areas of interest is the revolts and rebellions of the late medieval period. And absolutely that the post Black Death, when it really started kicking off, the cities were targeted by the state to destabilize those cities, and you see it obviously as well in the Germanic, like the Holy Roman Empire, because they wanted to destabilize the cities as the state was trying to steal back the power that the free cities had. So there's this challenge between the cities and the I guess the nobility. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Tristan Tabor comments, he says, there's also implications to the greatest sin of the time, suicide. Not sure how that plays in with the violence of it, but he does quote that 12-year-old kids are just dumb, and he did a senior thesis on Romeo and Juliet and cultural misinterpretation.
Oh yeah, I think I understand.
Yeah.
Yes, there is. Yeah, with Romeo and Juliet, absolutely. Yeah, I think I understand what he's talking about. Yeah.
Ken Before also commented that about skill at wrestling and disarming would be important in the cities.
Yeah, I mean, we know that everyone talks about everyone reflects on the Tudors and Henry, whichever. I focus mainly on like Flemish cities. So when everyone talks about the English stuff, Matt, you'll probably be like, oh, but requiring the English, banning of all sports and longbow, longbow training. Like that, from at least the 12th century, the urban centers had shooting guilds, like guilds that were specifically set up for crossbow and archery exclusively, and that was not only the Flemish lowlands but all around Europe, and those were not only military focused, to build standing archery or defense, but also sort of a convivial or confraternal practice, and they had huge tournaments, archery tournaments, and people came from all around Europe to compete in these archery tournaments, and I think that was just the English catching up to these great tournaments. But yeah, also there was the common practice to go to the commons and practice wrestling, and whatever else, all through the medieval period. Martial prowess was super important to the medieval person.
How much of that do you think was a level of social status? Because I'm assuming that the common laborer didn't have much time to devote to martial prowess practicing, even when mandated to. It's like, if you look at it from the English longbow point of view, per se, while there were certain mandates of how much a person was meant to practice, to the extent that they were actually carried out and enforced is sort of up in the air. So how much of that, the martial training and clubs was meant for more the middle and upper classes than the regular everyday worker?
Well, that's interesting, because like just in the context of the urban centers, the urban elites started creating martial nightly orders in emulation of the knights themselves. So they started creating these nightly orders, and the interesting thing about the Flemish lowlands they were holding their own foot tournaments in the the mid to late 14th century, where they're closing down whole entire towns for a week, and getting everyone from the surrounding towns to have these foot tournaments, like nightly foot tournaments, essentially, where the rest of Europe's nobility are like, merchant tournaments, we don't want to take part in that. But then when everyone bangs on about him, he wrote the tournament book. I can't remember his name. Sorry, it's early for me. 15th century Duke of Burgundy.
I know what
brain.
you're talking about. What the hell is it?
Philip of Artois? Is it not? That's not it.
Anjou? Is it? No.
Anjou, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, Anjou, yeah.
Anyway, yes, that fellow. He actually wrote that whole entire book inspired by these merchant night tournaments. Because he's like, foot tournaments? How cool are foot tournaments? And nightly tournaments in the 15th century had started dying out at that time. But he'd heard all, because he'd become the Duke of Flanders at the time, and he'd read some accounts of like these Flemish foot tournaments, and he got so juiced up about them. He wrote this whole entire book about tournaments and how everyone should do foot tournaments and how cool they were.
And it's Le Livre des Tournois, or King René's tournament book by René de Anjou.
That's it. Thank you. Yeah. So we have these nightly orders being formed by merchants, but also at the same time, what we would call the middle class, who are just common laborers or merchants or whomever else, forming really coherent, strong fighting forces, and they become in high demand for the militant elites in Europe as mercenaries. So somehow they're getting enough training to, they're not just, it's not just this idea that they're just picking up a stick and going out and hitting someone, and that's just the only training they get. And I'm very unclear on how this is happening. We do know that in the 15th century, particularly the Flemish lowlands, that's my jam, they were forming sword guilds, where everyone, it's like a separate guild, and it's the idea of a fraternity of swords, and you join it and they all practice martial arts, sword martial arts. Someone, I think Tim, said I might be interested in 17th century Dutch knife fighting culture. Oh yeah, I am. Very interested in that. Thanks for posting that link.
John Dowdle says that you have interesting thoughts about Shakespeare and Romeo and Juliet. Your perspective would seem more in line with the alternative theory that Shakespeare is actually Edward de la Vere or Francis Bacon. What are your thoughts on that?
I think I'm an
English major. I'm an English major, Andrew. We might have a knife fight here.
I don't know. I've always suspected it might be Francis Bacon. But that's just me. Make a cross.
Well, yeah. we'll have to agree to disagree on that one.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Well, I think that about. I'll say we have time for one more question.
Yeah.
You've heard it asked to everybody else. The most important question of what is your favorite sword, Andrew?
Oh, I think you already know.
I do already know, but
you already know. Yeah. So it's a replica. But it's Peter Regani, single-handed, late 14th century. Yeah, I love it.
And you made the scabbard for that, correct?
I did. Actually, on that subject, I've decided I'm going to make a new one. There'll be, yeah. It never ends. But yes, I love the sword. But you can never choose your favorite child. But I've done a lot of alterations on this. You know, if you've ever handled any of Peter's swords, which are beautiful, don't get me wrong, but you know, a lot of them come with just a sort of a HEMA tennis wrap hilt. So I re-hilted it. I've taken a lot of weight out of it, just in line with like more period accurate weights. So this one weighs just over 1 kilo. It's still too heavy though. Probably take a little more weight out of it, but if I do, it might unbalance it. But yeah, it's ridiculous. It's a redonkulous sword. Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today and giving that great talk. I learned a lot in that talk, things I hadn't known before.
My pleasure.
If you like listening to Andrew's talk, follow him on Facebook under the Modern Medieval Man. You're also on Instagram under that name as well, correct?
That's
and
right.
his YouTube channel, Popula Urbanum, where he and his partner Ocean put up a lot of great content. And she just put up she did the last couple of videos, didn't she?
Yes.
Yes, yeah, and they're really great. They're really great videos. So always learn a lot when watching him, and always love talking to you, Andrew. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, folks. So we're going to take another probably 5-10 minute break here quick, and then we'll be back with Damon Stith of Guild of the Silent Sword, and he will be teaching us and talking to us about traditional African martial arts and sword play. So stay tuned. We'll be back in a little bit.